Hi everyone, I'm Benjamin Bryant and this is Heather McKinnon from Bryant McKinnon Lawyers, and we're just about to record our fifth podcast of the Family Matters show. And again, it's Heather and myself, and like usual, we're recording this live, but with the intention of that it's going to be published as a podcast. So you will see all the cuts and bloopers and any mistakes that we made with any tongue twisters. And you may see our producer, Steph, as well come into the shot if she needs to. If that happens, no dramas there. Everything is going as usual, of course. So we're ready to get started?
We are.
Excellent. All right. Hello again, everyone. Welcome to episode 5 of the Family Matters Show podcast, in which we will tackle the really tough questions of how to reach a reasonable and fair agreement about the kids. I'm your host, Benjamin Bryant, an accredited family law specialist with Bryant McKinnon Lawyers, and I'm joined today by my partner in crime, Heather McKinnon. Hi, Heather.
Hi, Ben. It's great to be back, and I'm especially excited about today's show because we're focusing on children. Nothing upsets me more in our work than seeing the children subjected to the collateral damage of relationship breakdown. I'm hoping that today we can help parents stay focused on kids through the stress of divorce and leave adult issues away from the kids.
Agreed. And for those who may not be aware, Heather is not only an accredited family law specialist, she is also an independent children's lawyer, which means she is qualified to represent children in court proceedings. So Heather is particularly attuned to the welfare and interests of children during separation and divorce. Today we are going to zero in on the two big issues that need to be sorted when it comes to the kids: financial support and living arrangements after separation. For the purpose of this podcast, we are going to assume that you listeners out there are interested in finding fair solutions that support your kids. So if you're just itching for a fight and willing to sacrifice the children to get your way, this is probably not the podcast for you.
Well said, Ben. Balance, fairness and a focus on the children are critical to getting post-separation parenting right. So we're going to try and help you do today.
All right, Heather, so let's get into it. And we're going to start with the financial support for children. If I'm a parent who wants to do the right thing for my children, what do I need to consider when working out fair financial arrangements after separation?
So what we know from longitudinal studies is the worst thing that can expose kids to is conflict, and the second worst thing you can expose them to is poverty. So all parents, when they decide to have kids, know that it's going to be a lifetime commitment. And that usually means, for most of us who have kids, that you put your own needs aside and you do everything you can to strengthen the next generation. Unfortunately, when people separate, they sometimes forget that that's what they've been doing for years. They've been putting their children ahead of themselves. So really, the first thing I'd encourage people to do is to have a look at the value system they had as a couple. So for example, most parents want their kids to do extracurricular activities like sport, dance, gymnastics, drama. It's important that when you separate, you don't suddenly start to change everything about the kids' lives. Well, I don't want to pay private school fees, so we'll whack them out of school. And I know they love playing soccer, but that doesn't suit me anymore. What I really encourage people to do is to try and keep everything the same for the kids other than where they're living, so that they have the security of their known routine as much as possible. When you whack out the tablecloth off the family and literally throw everything up in the air, you've got to remember that the kids' reactions magnified hundreds of times more than you as an adult, because most adults have faced a crisis sometime in their life already and they're a bit resilient and they know that they're going to recover. For little ones, often the breakdown of the family is the first big crisis. So you as parents need to marshal them through it and teach them that it's okay, even though the wheels have come off, it will get better. And the best way you can do that is to buffer them from the financial stress of split. keep them at the same schools, work together to keep them in their same routines. It's going to be hard financially because you've now got two households to run, but rather than, you know, having an overseas holiday with your new partner, you might be better to look at keeping the kids' school fees paid up for a year, or making sure that they can do representative sport if they're really good at athletics. So there's some of the sort of tips that in that financial stuff.
I think that's a really practical way forward and a really logical way to look at it, Heather, because I know that a lot of people, when they talk to me about child support arrangements or provisions, they're not actually talking about the cost. It's an emotive thing. It's, why should I pay that to my ex? You know, if she's just going to go on overseas holidays or go to the movies, I'm here, I'm working like a dog, I'm doing all these things, and it's going to the children. They don't think it's going to the children, it's actually going to the spouse, and you have to remind them that although that may be the case in some circumstances, the expenses for the children are the same before separation as after separation, and vice versa. You know? So it's still the same amount of income going in, do you know what I mean? And it needs to be paid somehow. Yeah,
it's really a bit different nowadays because we do have the child support agency that objectively looks at what each parent's able to contribute to the kids. But practically what I tend to suggest to parents is that you get an agreement on what the expenses are for each child, and you look at, okay, how are we going to rearrange our budget so that we can both fairly contribute to the extent that we're able to what the kids need. One of the other things that you've got to realise is the separation doesn't end that financial commitment to children. I mean, for middle class families in Australia, that means supporting them through to the end of their first undergraduate degree. So if you separate when kids are in primary school, you've got another 10, 15 years of working together to help the kids complete the HSC, get to uni and get their first degree. It's a long haul, and nothing's changed just because you're separated. The long haul started when you decided to have kids. Breakdown of the relationship doesn't mean that long haul suddenly sometimes some way disappears.
And when working out financial plans, can you or should you take into account what is expected to happen in the future? For example, one partner may be likely to receive a large inheritance, or one partner currently has a low income but is on a career path that is likely to mean that they will have a big salary in the future. So these are obviously windfalls or things that are coming, positive things that are coming for the future.
Yeah, I mean, obviously all those things matter because the quality of outcome for the kids doesn't just rely on the money that's available to the mum and the dad. So the first example there of if one party's got parents that are likely to give a large inheritance, I often recommend to people that you have the hard discussion with your parents if the marriage ends and you've, for example, got the kids at a private school or you've got them doing a lot of extracurricular activities. You might ring your parents and say, can you help out with some money now for the kids, which would take the pressure off. It's something that people feel sometimes uncomfortable to do, but if it's the decision about not having the kids stay at the same school or do their sport, then my experience is grandparents are more than willing to come in and do a little bit of an advance on an inheritance to make sure the grandkids are stabilised at the time of the parent separation.
And it might be a lump sum payment or a periodical payment or term fees or annual fees or something.
And people forget that it does take a community to raise, kids, and I see grandparents every day in practice who are stressing about the impact of the failure of their kids' marriage on their grandchildren. And it is a chance for grandparents to step up to the mark and help stabilise the little ones whose lives have been chucked into turmoil without them having any role in that. The other thing is to look at that income in the future. The way the child support system works in Australia is that you're paying an amount of money each week and it's adjusted at the end of tax year. So, for example, if a couple separate when they're young and they're both still studying for their professions, and their income goes up over the lifetime of the children, then child support commitments go up. So you don't really need to second guess, how am I going to get more money if my ex gets higher income, because the child support system adjusts it automatically. And so the children will benefit from the attention that a parent has paid to their career to increase their income, to increase the outcomes for their kids.
And we'll get to the child support system in a little bit. But what about the negatives or the unexpected changes of things that might come up? For example, party losing their job or another partner remarries is a common one. How can, when discussing child support arrangements, how can parties account for that?
So obviously unemployment is becoming a bigger issue at the moment in the economy. When we go into a period of recession and people lose their jobs, people need to understand that that may have happened whether you were together or you were separated, and plans for financial events need to be made by parents as if they were together. You need to always be mindful of having things in place, if at all possible, like income protection insurance, a savings account that is there for a rainy day for things like the kids' expenses if the worst happens. But poverty hits everybody and you can't control everything. All you can do is do your best and remember that the system acknowledges that at periods of an adult's life they may have less income and the child support will be adjusted accordingly. Yeah.
And in respect to the options available for child support, which I think we need to talk about, because even in our roles, of course, as family lawyers, we don't have much to do with the child support system, because there's a conception out there, or a misconception out there, that when parties are separating, obviously they have to deal with all these issues, but it's a one-stop shop, or it's different. It's the one set of legislation or one set of rules, but of course we know that's not true. Child support is under the Child Support Assessment Act, and what we do every day is of course under the Family Law Act. And so we always sending people to the Department of Human Services, and we're discussing perhaps the alternatives to doing an assessment through child support. So what are some of those alternatives, Heather?
So the people who can keep their heads together get very creative. So for example, if you have a separation where typically the mum's still home with preschoolers and the parties are looking at a solution that keeps the kids in the house, what some parents are able to negotiate is a thing called a capitalised child support agreement, so that the mother agrees that rather than receiving weekly child support for the next 10 years, she takes less weekly child support, and on that basis is able to keep the house, because the child support that she's foregoing can be deemed a capital transfer in real estate. So, for example, the mother may need $50,000 to pay the father out, and they've got 3 children under school age. We can help draft an agreement that says that the father has prepaid, for example, $15,000 worth of child support for each child, and the mother accepts that he's prepaid that by transferring the house to her, and her not having to borrow the $50,000 from the bank. So this is quite a complex system, but you do see sensible parents able to look at creative solutions like that when they're focused on how do we keep the kids in their known environment.
Yes. And so that that sense in that example with the $15,000, that's essentially used as a credit towards a child support assessment. But also, if parties can agree between themselves, sometimes no lawyers are involved, there's no documents involved, they just do the child support assessment. isn't involved at all, and they just do it informally. Other times, parties like to have their ducks in a row, or to have a document as enshrining their agreement. And so there's a couple of forms of agreements that you can do under the child support legislation. One is limited child support, which is a document which essentially says we're going to agree to pay, the non-carer will pay to the carer parent or the full-time carer parent a certain figure that has to be equal to or more than the assessable rate, and that automatically expires after 3 years, or if there's a change in circumstances which would vary the assessment by around 15%. The other type of agreement is a binding child support agreement, whereby there is no minimum, the parties can agree to what they want, and there's no termination except for when the child is 18 or finishes school. And of course there's a requirement that they obtain independent legal advice in respect to that agreement. For the listeners, you can actually go onto the Department of Human Services website, Child Support, and there's an online calculator. And you can punch in your details, punch in your partner's details, and actually spit out a figure, which would be roughly an assessment that you could be expected to pay. You can then sit down, either with your partner or without, and figure out if that's going to cut it, if that's enough, because obviously we're using costs, on a scale and a table that the complex formula spits out, and it may well be that your family circumstances are different. For more information as well, apart from the Department of Human Services, I would go to, I made a note of it, the Child Support Guide on the Department of Services website. I'll make that link available in the podcast and on our Facebook page as well. It is a great resource which explains the child support provisions, because it is quite a complex area.
And for, I suppose, to the listeners too, middle class Australians are the ones that are mostly caught in the child support legislative framework. At the top end, once you're on incomes over that sort of 150,000, you're more likely to be tailor-making an agreement for your family, and the legislation accepts that. It says that those high-income families need to make a purpose-fit agreement. The agency's there to cover the great bulk of people in Australia who earn between 50 and 150,000. The high net worth people are in a whole different category of how you look at what the cost of kids are.
And just quickly, Heather, because we're all about practical tips. I know we get a lot of questions at child support in relation to school fees when there's private school fees. What are some of the things that you hear about, or the things that you advise clients in respect to the payment of school fees and how it's calculated, or whether it's included in the child support assessment?
So the common scenario is that there's 3 kids and they've been at a local Catholic primary school or an Anglican school or Christian school for all of their schooling. The marriage ends and suddenly one party decides that that's no longer appropriate because they can't afford it. Now, the agency actually recognises what we're talking about at the beginning, that stability is really important for kids, and they will intervene to enforce the payment of those fees if at all possible. Obviously, that's subject to things like unemployment, whether or not there's enough money to go around, but assuming that people were in the same employment they were when they were together, there's no earthly reason that the kids shouldn't stay at those schools. So people need to understand that divorce isn't a way of avoiding financial responsibility, and they will, the agency will look at whether or not that's a reasonable decision to whack the kids out of where they've always been, which is different to the other argument, which is a child's 4 when the parties separate. One party wants to send the child to the most expensive private school in Sydney, and the other one wants to send them to a local primary school. Those debates play out in the family court in Sydney and Brisbane and Melbourne every day of the week. And there, that in the regional Australia, which is where a lot of our listeners are, we really don't see those high net worth individuals who will take it up to the spouse on whether the kids are going to go to one of the big GPS private schools.
And I think in terms of the child support assessment, they're very much interested on the intention of the parties. So, for example, if it's both parents signing the enrolment form on the private school and the fees are still coming, then it would be expected that the intention is that they stay there and that the fees keep getting paid by both parents.
And I suppose the other area that we see more often than not is families impacted by disability with children. So we have, a very high component of matters where the parents don't cope with disability, and it's one of the stresses that leads to the breakdown of the marriage. For example, 2 or 3 little children who are born and there's no obvious problem, but by the time they're 5 or 6, it's clear that they're profoundly autistic. That things like that happen all the time, and in those families, the added expense of the disability is often something that leads to conflict. One parent may be in denial about the child's needs. For example, children who have disabilities may need additional help and support, such as speech therapy, occupational therapy, some of the services that need to be paid for that aren't covered by Medicare. Parents will then get into conflict. Those are cases, again, where the agency will initially help to look at whether there's extraordinary expenses and whether or not the parents have the capacity to try and meet those needs of the child over and above what the normal assessment would be if the child didn't have the disability. So if you have that situation, there is some modification to the standard stock solution that you need to talk through with, as you said, with the agency itself, or if that doesn't work, you may need to have a lawyer look at it with you.
And we'll leave the financial side of things for now, Heather, and move on to the living arrangements or spend time with arrangements for the children. But what I want to say to the listeners also is that at the time of separation, when you're doing a property settlement, obviously you're discussing financial circumstances of each parent, and there are crossovers between child support, spousal maintenance, and of course any adjustment in respect to the property settlement. So I encourage the listeners to go and check out our other podcasts where we cover those issues as well. Okay. In terms of the parenting arrangements for children, back in the day we used to use child custody and full custody and things like that, and people still do that. But of course the legislation doesn't mention the word custody in there anymore. It's all about live with and spend time with arrangements for children. And Heather, you've been helping people to make parenting arrangements for a very long time, plus you've represented children in court on these types of matters. Do you have a sense of what sort of living arrangements work best for children after separation?
It's all about the parents. You see a problem with kids, and it's normally because the parents are in some sort of conflict. So the research says that for primary school children, the best outcome for kids is a shared arrangement where there's significant care by both mum and dad. So same parents who are both equally skilled at looking after their kids will do week on, week off. Unfortunately, there is not many of those high-functioning parents that separate because they know how to communicate. So the very fact that they are like that means that they've got a higher chance of the marriage surviving. So we're thrown into the situation when the family breaks down, the parents, by the very nature of the breakdown of the relationship, often have a dysfunctional way of communicating with each other. So the research says that we have to be careful to analyse how to protect the children from conflict. So we talk about changeovers at school on Fridays in high-functioning families, But interestingly, in families that don't function well, because changeover at school means mum and dad don't come into contact with each other, and so the kids aren't seeing any nasty stuff. But in saying that, little children, preschoolers and infant school children, don't seem to thrive being away from their primary attachment figure until they're confident and they're well through the ravages of what the separation did to them. So parents need to be very careful to stay in tune with their children and to not throw them into something that sounds logical to adults. It may be better to, with little ones, to have an arrangement where they see the spend time with parent regularly, but for shorter periods of time. So that's where we get the common arrangement of picking up the kids on a Friday afternoon at school, taking them back on a Monday morning, and then having them for a night in the off week. That works really well for some kids where the parents are struggling with communication. And then you get the other extreme where parental capacity with one parent is so poor that the children don't ever see that parent. And that's where we're dealing with violent parents, parents who are really unable to put the needs of children before their own. They're very rare cases, but they are sadly the ones that we have to deal with as independent children's lawyers, where there has to be a very careful consideration made as to whether one parent should in fact spend any time with their children. So you've got all these extremes, and obviously in previous podcasts we've talked to some really good child psychologists, mental health social workers. They're the people that we rely on to help parents make appropriate child-focused decisions if they're not doing it themselves. Because as lawyers, we can give you a lot of options, but we don't know your kids. We don't know their temperaments, we don't know their needs, and you really need to involve a social scientist to help you both with that decision making if you're struggling.
That's right, because all families are different, all children are different, and like you said, with younger children, especially 4 and under, they, as you said before, it's more developmentally appropriate for them, usually, to be with the primary parent, with the primary attachment, and spend short but regular time with the other parent, and that might be after work or something for a couple of hours, if they can communicate, if there's relatively conflict free, and they can communicate. But also, it's really important on the other end of the spectrum for older children, 13, 14, 15-year-old children. It mightn't be normal for them to spend a whole weekend with any parent, regardless.
These adolescent care arrangements, absolutely.
That's right. Because you have situations where you have one parent's asking for the weekend, and the other parents were like, well, man, I'd like a whole weekend with my 15-year-old, but it's never going to happen. They're always doing other things. So, and Heather, I know that nowhere in the Family Law Act does it specify any default arrangement or any particular spend time with arrangement. So why is there this social construct about alternate weekends and half school holiday? Where did that come about?
It came about, I think, more because it's convenient for lawyers and judges, and it particularly was that way in the 70s and 80s when the Family Law Act was a fairly new thing, and in fact Australian families breaking down was a relatively new thing. We didn't understand a lot about the impact of divorce on children when the culture started to face these issues. We've now had 50 years of longitudinal research on the children whose parents separated in the 70s and 80s, so we're getting a much better sense of what the parents did back at the time of the breakdown of the family that either aided or damaged the children. So it's a product of time, and certainly the role of the father in the culture in that time has completely been revolutionised. I mean, when I was born, my poor dad wasn't allowed in the labour ward to see me born. He had to see me held up in a mirror, a couple of hours after I was born, versus my husband, who was present, at the birth of our children, and then went on to be the primary carer when they were little. So you've got, in our lifetime, for the people who are my age, who are 60, we've had this huge social change in the way that dads are hands-on with their children, and the realisation that children are much more robust if they have input from both mum and dad, much more robust. And so we're really making decisions in an evolutionary way to try and make kids stronger, but it's a product of time, research and attention to what actually is best for kids.
And for resources in respect to parenting arrangements and the effect of conflict on children, I'd recommend our listeners have a look at the Family Law Court's webpage, but also to see what the social science says and what are age-appropriate arrangements for children. I'd encourage them to have a look at the website Children Beyond Dispute, and again we'll make that available somewhere on our website and close to the podcast so they can access that. In terms of living arrangements, there is almost always complications, little bumps in the roads happening. I'm going to mention just a couple of them, Heather, and I'd like to get your thoughts on how parents can try and find fair solutions to jump those hurdles. Blended families, when you have step-parents, step-children, obviously the Family Law Act talks about subject children, the children subject to the proceedings, but what about the relationship with others?
Yeah, the caveat on all of this is the biggest stress, they reckon, causing the breakdown of second relationships is step-parent issues. So this is fraught with difficulty. So in blended families, it is really important that the couples work to look at what's best for the group of kids that the two households are trying, or 3 or 4 households sometimes, are trying to manage. So in highly functional blended family situations, parents will negotiate that one household has all of the kids on one weekend, so those sibling bonds are built. But we get more and more complex situations if we have, for example, one party to a second relationship may have their kids week on, week off. The other party may have them every alternate weekend. So then you get all these stresses about lining up the weekends. And
changeover location, soccer games on Saturdays.
It takes goodwill, it takes intelligence, it takes absolute commitment to keep talking it through. How are we going to manage the Brady Bunch? I mean, I always laugh about the impact on all of us of the Brady Bunch, and we never found out what happened to the real mum and dad. But anyway, so it's really important. It is the number one stressor. So it's very important to look at the resources available when you're trying to work out how to fix it all. And can I please plead with people, have that cup of coffee when you both re-partner. Try and build working relationships as parents. There is nothing more joyful to go to a wedding and see the mum and the dad, biological parents, with their new partners and the family acceptance that is life now and that everyone gets on. It does take enormous skill, but it does, it works well for many Australian families, but it's hard because the level of scheduling just gets more and more complex. The more and more kids are involved in the mix.
And what I say, Heather, as well, as I take it back to Section 60cc of the Family Law Act, where always interested in what's in the best interest of the children, and the court will only ever make an order in relation to children when it's satisfied that it's in the best interest of children. To get to that consideration or that assessment is not just plucked out of the air. There's a legislative pathway and criteria that the court must follow. And of course it's Section 60cc, subsection 3, B and D. It talks about the nature of the relationship with children and significant others. That might be step-parents, it might be step-siblings, maybe grandparents. And at subsection D, it also talks about the likely effect of any change in circumstances it'll have on the children and their relationship with those people. So it is absolutely in. It's absolutely in. the Family Law Act to the consideration of those relationships as well. And just quickly, Heather, on another complication that arises is work. Relocation, relocation for work, or perhaps just relocation in general. How can parties try and bridge that gap?
In Australia, we have the most mobile...
Hang on. Just let yourself cough for a second and then answer the question.
Yeah.
Sorry, guys.
No, that's...
That's amazing. So with relocation, we know Australia is one of the most mobile populations on the planet. Because of the nature of our economy, reliant on things like the mining industry, we have a relatively high need for very skilled professionals, such as medical professionals, but only a handful of them qualified. So, for example, you might be a nurse unit manager in a cardiology unit, and there might be only 5 hospitals in Australia that you can work in. So, what I ask people to do always is, if one spouse has to relocate for work, just think about what would have happened when you were together. You would have had to look at it anyway. With technology, kids can maintain relationships very easily once they get to primary and high school through the use of Skype or phones, as long as they can have good block time with the parent that they're leaving. It's a real balance between the needs of children to not live in poverty and the need to have face-to-face time. Most of these decisions are made because parents realise if they take the higher salary, they'll be able to help the kids much more in terms of achieving, for example, getting to uni. So again, they're complex decisions. The court has to look at what's best for the child, and every single case is different. It is, it seems like a real hard blow at the time, but it can be the making of kids, because they find that they can have the parent they move to a capital city with is happy in their work and their life, so that's cruisy during school term, and then when they have the block holidays and weekends with the other parent, that parent's not at work relaxed because everything's sorted. It can work, it's hard, but we're stuck with the cases where there is a real roadblock about what's best for the kids. Should they stay where they are or go with the parents moving?
And of course, the Family Law Act in Section 65DAA says that not only does a court can a court make an order that's only in the best interest of the children, but it has to be reasonably practicable. The parties have to be able to pull it off, otherwise there's no point to it. So it's really about trying to find that correct balance, that appropriate balance of maintaining a meaningful relationship with the children and both their parents, but in a way that's practicable, in a way that they can do it. Okay. And if parties can't work out living arrangements for children amicably, or between themselves, there are some ways they can do that without going to court. Of course, we have assistance with family dispute resolution practitioners or agencies such as Interrelate in Coffs Harbour or the Family Relationship Centre. If parties are eligible for legal aid, they can do family dispute resolution through the legal aid process. We also have private family dispute resolution practitioner. We had a meeting with one just yesterday, which is great, a newcomer to Coffs Harbour, which we're excited about. So there's all different ways that parties can get assistance to try and help them come up with an arrangement for their children that's in the best interest of their children. Sometimes, perhaps, and this is what's also the benefit of Interrelate, is that it's not about just getting in the room and having a mediator to regulate or monitor the communication style between the parties. Sometimes there might need to be some other information. There may need to be a parenting program. There may need to be a drug test. Then there may need to be an anger management course. There may need to be, especially for teenagers, maybe some family therapy to explore what is happening with the relationship with the other parent rather than pinning it on a particular parent. So I think it's just really important to mention those things, that if you can't reach an agreement yourselves, doesn't mean to say you're going straight to court.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's our show for this month. Thank you, Heather, for your sage advice on these children's matters.
Well, no worries, Ben. Look, it's what makes my life in the profession. I love working on cases involving decision making that will help kids maximise their potential.
And I couldn't agree with you more. Thank you to our listeners for joining us again, and most of all for being willing to put their focus on what's best for the children. We hope you found this podcast helpful, and as always, we will include a list of helpful resources in the show notes for episode 5 on our website. Next month, we've got a special guest on the show to talk about a very difficult issue. Doug Andrews is a psychiatrist at Baringa Hospital in Coffs Harbour, and he is going to help us to understand the impacts of family violence and how to heal the emotional wounds family violence leave behind. It's a really challenging subject, and we're very happy to have someone of Doug's expertise to tackle the subject with us. If you have specific questions you would like to see answered about family violence, please send them to us via Facebook Messenger or by emailing familymatters@bryantmckinnon.com.au. Goodbye for now, and we'll hope you'll be listening next month.